Imagine waking up on a normal morning, checking your phone, and seeing that your salary has been credited just like every other month, with the same number you have always trusted to support your life. At first, nothing feels different because the system appears to be functioning normally. Your job exists, your employer has paid you, and your bank balance reflects the expected amount. But within hours, as you step outside and begin interacting with the real economy, a subtle but disturbing shift begins to reveal itself in ways you were not prepared for. The prices you see are no longer the prices you remember, and the difference is not small enough to ignore or rationalize as a temporary fluctuation. You notice that basic items cost significantly more than they did just days ago, and the increase feels disconnected from anything you can explain logically. At first you assume it is a mistake or a short-term disruption, something that will stabilize once the system corrects itself. But as the day continues, the pattern repeats itself everywhere you go, and the realization becomes impossible to ignore. Your salary has not changed, but what it can actually buy has collapsed in a matter of hours or days. And that is the moment where something fundamental breaks, not in the system itself, but in your understanding of how money is supposed to work. Because you were taught that earning money creates stability, but no one explained what happens when the value of that money disappears faster than you can earn it. On Economic Chronicles, we break down how money actually works behind the system, not what you are told, but what is really happening beneath the surface of everyday financial life. Because once you begin to see these patterns clearly, you stop reacting emotionally and start understanding the structure that shapes financial outcomes over time. This is not about shortcuts or quick solutions. It is about understanding the rules that continue operating whether you notice them or not. And once you see those rules clearly, the way you think about money and stability begins to change in ways that are difficult to reverse. The first thing you need to understand is that your salary does not become worthless because your employer stops paying you. It becomes worthless because the currency it is paid in stops holding stable value. This distinction is critical because it shifts the problem away from income and toward the system that defines what income actually means. In most cases, the collapse of salary value is not caused by a single event, but by a chain of decisions that weaken the currency over time. Governments print more money to manage debt, to stimulate growth, or to respond to crises that require immediate financial intervention. At first, this process appears harmless because it increases liquidity and allows the system to continue functioning without interruption, but over time, as more money enters the system without a proportional increase in real economic output, the value of each unit of currency begins to decline. This decline is not always visible immediately, which is why it is often ignored until it reaches a point where it can no longer be hidden. When that point is reached, prices begin to adjust rapidly, reflecting the new reality of how much money exists relative to available goods, and that adjustment happens faster than most people expect, creating a gap between income and cost that expands almost overnight. That gap is where your salary starts losing its meaning in real terms. This is not a theoretical concept. It has happened repeatedly across different countries and time periods with striking similarity. In Weimar Germany during the early 1920s, workers were paid multiple times a day because the value of money was collapsing so quickly that waiting even a few hours reduced its purchasing power significantly. People would receive their wages and immediately rush to spend them before prices increased again, turning income into a race against time. Savings became meaningless because money stored even for a short period lost a significant portion of its value. The system did not stop paying people. In fact, it paid them more frequently than ever before. But the frequency of payment did not solve the underlying problem, which was the collapse of the currency itself. This created a situation where income existed in nominal terms but failed completely in practical terms. And once that happens, the concept of a stable salary stops making sense entirely, because stability requires consistency, and consistency disappears when value becomes unpredictable. That is the moment when earning money no longer guarantees survival in the way people expect. A similar pattern can be seen in more recent examples such as Venezuela, where hyperinflation destroyed the value of wages over a relatively short period. Workers continued to receive salaries, but those salaries could no longer cover basic living expenses even for a few days. Prices changed so frequently that planning became impossible, and financial decisions lost their meaning. People shifted from thinking about saving money to simply trying to spend it as quickly as possible before it lost more value. This created a survival-based financial behavior where long-term thinking was replaced by immediate action, because in an environment where money loses value rapidly, time itself becomes a cost. Holding money becomes a liability instead of an advantage, and the faster that realization spreads, the faster the system begins to destabilize further, because trust in money is what holds the system together, and once that trust breaks, the system struggles to function normally. This is how salary becomes disconnected from reality, not because it disappears, but because it stops representing stable value. Another critical factor is how quickly this transition can happen once it begins accelerating beyond control. In stable systems, inflation moves gradually, allowing people to adjust their behavior over time without major disruption. But in unstable systems, that gradual movement can suddenly turn into rapid acceleration, catching people completely off guard. What used to change over years starts changing over months, then weeks, and sometimes even days. This compression of time is what makes the situation feel chaotic and unpredictable, because people are not given enough time to adapt to the new conditions before they change again. Your salary may increase, but if prices increase faster, the increase becomes irrelevant. This creates the illusion of progress while masking an underlying decline in purchasing power. And over time, that illusion becomes impossible to maintain as the gap continues to widen. That is when the system starts to feel unstable even if it continues operating on the surface. The most dangerous part of this entire process is that it does not begin as a crisis. It begins as a slow shift that most people do not recognize immediately. Small price increases are dismissed, minor changes are ignored, and the system appears stable enough to trust. But beneath that appearance, pressure continues to build until it reaches a point where it can no longer be contained. When that happens, the transition from stability to instability happens much faster than people expect. And by the time it becomes obvious, the options available to respond are already limited, because the system has already adjusted, and individuals are left reacting instead of preparing. This is why understanding the mechanism is more important than predicting the timing, because the pattern repeats even when the details change. And once you recognize the pattern, you begin to see early signals that most people ignore. That awareness is what separates reaction from preparation. Once your salary stops holding real value, the most important shift does not happen in the market. It happens inside your daily decision-making process in ways that are difficult to reverse. Because when money loses its reliability, every choice you make becomes more urgent, more uncertain, and more focused on immediate survival rather than long-term stability. You stop thinking in months or years and begin thinking in hours or days, because waiting itself becomes a financial risk. This change in time perception is one of the earliest signs that the system is no longer functioning in a stable and predictable way. And once that shift happens, it spreads quickly across society as more people begin to react to the same conditions simultaneously. This creates a feedback loop where individual behavior starts accelerating the very problem that caused it in the first place. People rush to spend money before it loses more value, which increases demand and pushes prices even higher. As prices rise faster, the urgency to spend increases, creating a cycle that becomes difficult to control once it gains momentum. This is not irrational behavior. It is a logical response to a system where holding money guarantees loss instead of security. And when logical responses produce unstable outcomes, the system enters a phase where stability becomes increasingly difficult to restore. At this stage, your salary continues to exist, but it no longer serves its original purpose of providing predictable support for your life over time. Instead, it becomes something you need to convert into usable value as quickly as possible before it loses more purchasing power. This changes the function of income from a tool for planning into a tool for immediate exchange. Long-term financial strategies begin to break down because the assumptions they rely on are no longer valid. Saving money becomes risky because the value stored today may not exist tomorrow in the same form. Investing becomes unpredictable because market conditions change too rapidly to make informed decisions. Even basic budgeting becomes ineffective because prices move faster than any plan you can create. This creates a situation where traditional financial advice stops working entirely, because that advice was designed for stable systems, not for environments where value itself is unstable. And when the foundation changes, every structure built on top of it begins to fail. Another critical effect is the breakdown of trust between individuals and the system that manages money. Trust is what allows people to accept money as a reliable medium of exchange without questioning its value every moment. When that trust begins to weaken, people start looking for alternatives that can preserve value more effectively. This can include foreign currencies, physical assets, or even barter systems in extreme situations. The shift does not happen all at once. It begins slowly as people test different ways to protect themselves. But as more people move away from the local currency, its value declines further, accelerating the problem. This creates a self-reinforcing cycle where loss of trust leads to loss of value, and loss of value leads to further loss of trust. Breaking this cycle is extremely difficult because it requires restoring confidence at a scale that is hard to achieve quickly, and without confidence, even functional systems struggle to operate effectively. This is why currency stability depends as much on perception as it does on policy. The labor market is also affected in ways that are not immediately obvious but become significant over time. Employers may increase wages to keep up with rising costs, but those increases often lag behind actual price changes. This creates a situation where workers are constantly behind, even if their nominal income appears to be increasing. Negotiations become more frequent, but less effective, because the underlying problem is not the salary amount but its value. Some businesses struggle to adjust quickly enough and begin reducing operations or shutting down entirely. This leads to job losses, which further reduce economic stability and increase uncertainty across the system. At the same time, skilled workers may leave for more stable environments, reducing the overall productivity of the economy. This creates additional pressure on the system, making recovery even more difficult, because economic stability depends on both confidence and participation, and both begin to decline simultaneously. This is how a currency issue expands into a broader economic crisis over time. Another layer of impact is psychological, affecting how people think about effort, reward, and the value of work itself. When your salary no longer provides stability, the connection between effort and outcome begins to weaken. You may work the same hours, apply the same skills, and produce the same results, but the reward feels insufficient or meaningless. This creates frustration and confusion, because the system no longer behaves in a way that feels fair or predictable. Over time, motivation declines as the perceived benefit of effort decreases. People begin to question the value of long-term commitment in an environment that does not reward it consistently. This shift affects productivity, innovation, and overall economic activity, because systems rely on the belief that effort leads to progress, and when that belief weakens, participation becomes less stable and less reliable. This is how economic problems begin to affect social behavior at a deeper level. The most dangerous point in this entire process is when instability becomes normalized, and people begin to adapt permanently to a lower level of expectation. Instead of expecting stability, people begin to expect volatility and adjust their behavior accordingly. This can include holding less money, making faster decisions, and avoiding long-term commitments entirely. While these adjustments may help individuals survive in the short term, they reduce the overall stability of the system, because long-term planning is what allows economies to grow and develop sustainably. Without it, the system becomes reactive rather than proactive. This limits growth, reduces investment, and creates an environment where uncertainty becomes the dominant condition. And once that environment is established, it becomes difficult to reverse, because rebuilding stability requires time, trust, and consistent policy, all of which are difficult to achieve under pressure. This is why the effects of currency collapse often last long after the initial event. The final realization is not about fear, but about understanding how fragile financial stability can be when it depends entirely on systems that can change rapidly. Why our salary is not just a number. It is a representation of value that depends on trust, policy, and economic conditions all working together. When those elements remain stable, your income supports your life in predictable ways. But when they begin to shift, even slightly, the impact can grow much larger over time. This does not mean collapse is inevitable, but it does mean that stability is not guaranteed. And recognizing that difference is what allows you to think more clearly about how systems operate. Because once you understand the structure, you stop assuming permanence and start recognizing patterns. Those patterns repeat across different countries, different time periods, and different economic conditions. And while the details may change, the underlying mechanisms remain surprisingly consistent. Understanding those mechanisms is not about predicting the future, it is about seeing the present more clearly than most people do.